All right, so welcome everyone to this deep dive. And today we're doing something a little different. We're going to be exploring the life and presidency of John Quincy Adams. But get this, our source material is actually another podcast.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it's an episode from American History Hit. And it's really cool because they use this really conversational style to bring history to life.
Yeah, I've heard that podcast. It's really good.
Yeah, so we're going to kind of do our own deep dive into their deep dive.
You each delve into a deep dive.
Exactly.
Oh, okay.
And, one of the things that I found really fascinating about this episode is that it starts off with this image of John Quincy Adams skinny dipping in the Potomac River every morning.
What? Every morning?
Every morning.
Wow.
Can you imagine, any modern president doing that? It's just
That's incredible.
So it really sets the stage for, understanding Adams as, a man of his time.
Yeah, definitely. He was born in 1767, right in the thick of the Revolutionary era.
Wow.
He even served alongside his father, John Adams.
Oh, yeah.
One of the key figures in the fight for independence.
Our second president.
Exactly.
So, talk about American royalty, right? Grew up with the Founding Fathers.
Yeah.
Witnessed the birth of a nation firsthand.
Absolutely. But you have to remember, the America he inherited as president in 1825 was vastly different from the one his father helped create.
Of course. Yeah.
This is where things get really interesting, I think. We're talking about a period of intense transition. America is about 50 years old at this point, still a young nation.
Right.
But it's rapidly expanding westward. The economy's transforming.
Yeah.
And there's this surge in democratic participation.
More people voting.
Exactly. More and more people demanding a voice in government.
So was John Quincy Adams this son of a founding father?
Mm-hmm.
Was he a man out of time? Or was he able to adapt to this changing landscape?
That's the big question, right? And to really grapple with that, I think we have to look at the contested election of 1824.
Oh, yeah.
The podcast describes it as a political earthquake. And in some ways, it foreshadows many of the partisan battles we see even today.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Okay. Let's dive into that then.
Yeah.
So I know the 1824 election was a four-way race with Andrew Jackson emerging as the popular vote winner, but without a clear majority in the Electoral College.
That's right. And because no candidate secured a majority, the election went to the House of Representatives to decide.
Oh, wow.
And this was the first time this had ever happened.
Really?
Which set a precedent that unfortunately would be repeated in a few very contentious elections later on.
Yeah, we've seen that a few times, haven't we?
Yeah. So how did Adams actually end up winning if Jackson got more votes?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Well, the House chose Adams, but Jackson and his supporters cried foul.
They did not like that.
No. They claimed a corrupt bargain had been struck between Adams and Henry Clay, another candidate in the race, who later became Adams' Secretary of State.
Oh, so they're saying that there was some backroom deal
to
get Adams the presidency.
Exactly.
That's juicy.
It is. And it sounds like the kind of political maneuvering that would make today's headlines.
Oh, for sure.
Right?
Yeah.
So do you think there was any truth to these accusations?
Who knows? It's so hard to say.
It's hard to say for sure. The podcast doesn't really delve into that too deeply. But what's important is that this controversy cast a shadow over Adams's entire presidency.
So even though he won, he was already facing an uphill battle.
Yeah.
In terms of public opinion and political support.
For sure.
So what were some of the key issues he focused on during his time in office?
Well, Adams came into office with a pretty ambitious domestic agenda known as the American system.
Okay.
You can think of it as a blueprint for modernizing the nation.
Modernizing.
Yeah, and strengthening the federal government's role in the economy.
Interesting. So what were some of the key elements of this American system?
Well, it included proposals for federally funded infrastructure projects.
Like roads and bridges.
Like roads and canals to connect different parts of the country. It also emphasized investments in education and scientific research.
Wow. So he was really thinking big picture.
Yeah, long term. He even broke ground on the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal.
Wow.
A massive project intended to link the Potomac River to the Ohio River.
Oh, wow.
Opening up trade routes to the west.
He sounds like he was way ahead of his time in terms of understanding the importance of infrastructure and investing in the future.
And it's interesting because those debates about the role of government in the economy are still with us today.
Oh, absolutely.
Right.
Yeah.
And Adams faced similar pushback from those who believed that the federal government should have a more limited role.
Libertarians.
Exactly. But Adams was convinced that a strong central government was essential for national unity and progress.
But didn't his focus on things like infrastructure and tariffs end up alienating the South?
Yeah,
The podcast mentioned how those policies were seen as favoring the North over the agrarian South.
that's right. And this brings us to the ever-present issue of slavery, which loomed over Adams' presidency just as it would over the entire nation in the decades leading up to the Civil War.
So, how did Adams approach this incredibly divisive issue? Did he support slavery? Oppose it? Where did he stand?
Well, Adams personally opposed slavery.
He did.
Yeah, but he also recognized the legal and political complexities surrounding it.
I mean, this is,
A really touchy subject.
yeah. We have to remember the Constitution itself protected the institution of slavery at that time.
Right.
And any attempt to abolish it outright would have been incredibly difficult, if not impossible.
So how did he navigate that tension between his personal beliefs
Yeah.
and the political realities of the time?
Well, the tariffs of 1828, which was designed to protect northern industries,
Right.
really inflamed tensions with the South.
Yeah, I can see how that would happen.
Southern states felt like it was unfairly burdening them while benefiting northern manufacturers. Some even threatened nullification.
Nullification. That sounds pretty dramatic.
It is.
What does that mean? Basically, nullification was the idea that a state could refuse to enforce a federal law if it deemed that law to be unconstitutional.
Wow.
It was a very radical concept,
Yeah.
and it represented a serious challenge to the authority of the federal government.
So even though Adams himself opposed slavery, his policies ended up escalating tensions between the North and the South,
Yeah.
which, as we know, would eventually lead to the Civil War.
That's a good way to put it. It highlights the immense challenges Adams faced as president.
Yeah.
He was trying to govern a nation that was deeply divided on fundamental moral and economic issues.
Sounds like a tough job.
It was.
Yeah.
But before we jump to any conclusions about his presidency, I think we should take a step back and look at another aspect of his career where he really excelled diplomacy.
Okay. I'm intrigued. Tell me more about John Quincy Adams, the diplomat.
Yeah.
Okay, so we're learning that John Quincy Adams wasn't just a politician, he was a diplomat too.
Yeah.
It's fascinating to me how someone can excel in these very different arenas.
Well, if you think back to his early life, he actually spent a good chunk of his youth traveling through Europe with his father on various diplomatic missions. He was exposed to different cultures and languages, and he developed a deep understanding of international relations.
So he was practically groomed for diplomacy from a young age.
You could say that. And those early experiences really shaped his worldview and his approach to foreign policy. The podcast points to his time as Secretary of State under President James Monroe as a particularly successful period.
What were some of his key accomplishments as Secretary of State?
Well, for one, he played a pivotal role in acquiring Florida from Spain in 1819. This was a huge strategic victory for the United States as it solidified control over the southeastern part of the country and removed a potential threat from a foreign power.
That's pretty impressive.
Yeah.
But I also remember the podcast mentioning the Monroe Doctrine. What was Adams's role in that?
Yes, the Monroe Doctrine. It was a cornerstone of American foreign policy for centuries, and Adams was one of its primary architects. It essentially declared that the United States would oppose any further European colonization or interference in the Western Hemisphere.
So it was like saying, hey, Europe, hands off the Americas. This is our turf. I remember learning about it in school, but I never really connected it back to John Quincy Adams.
Right. Well, it's important to remember that he was a key figure in shaping that policy, and the doctrine has had a lasting impact on U.S. foreign policy, shaping American involvement in Latin America and the Caribbean for generations. It's a powerful example of how Adams's diplomatic skills helped define America's place on the world stage.
It's amazing to think about how the decisions made by these historical figures still reverberate today. But going back to Adams's presidency, we left off talking about the rising tensions over slavery and the South's anger over tariffs.
Yeah.
Did those issues ultimately lead to his defeat in the 1828 election?
They certainly played a role. The 1828 election was a very bitter and divisive contest with Andrew Jackson, who had lost to Adams in 1824, running on a platform of resentment and a promise to represent the interests of the common man.
So it sounds like Jackson was tapping into a populist wave of frustration with the political establishment. Does that sound familiar at all?
Hmm. It definitely echoes some of the political trends we've seen in more recent times. And Jackson's victory marked a significant shift in American politics. It ushered in an era of Jacksonian democracy, which emphasized greater democratic participation, but also, some would argue, a more limited role for the federal government.
So Adams, the son of a founding father who believed in a strong national government, was defeated by this rising tide of populism and a desire for a less centralized government.
Precisely. And it's interesting to think about how this transition from the Founding Fathers era to the Jacksonian era really reflects the evolution of American democracy itself.
Okay, but Adams' story doesn't end there, right?
Hmm.
The podcast talked about how he launched this unexpected second act in politics.
That's right. After his defeat in 1828, Adams could have easily retired from public life, but instead he decided to run for a seat in the House of Representatives, and he won.
What? The former president goes back to being just a congressman? That's wild. You'd think it would be the other way around. What motivated him to do that?
Well, the podcast host speculates that maybe he felt like he had unfinished business, or maybe he simply couldn't stay away from the political arena. Whatever the reason, his return to Congress marked the beginning of what many consider to be his most impactful period in public service.
So what did he focus on during his time in Congress?
Well, he quickly became a leading voice in the growing movement to abolish slavery. Remember, while he personally opposed slavery during his presidency, he was also constrained by the political realities of the time. But now, as a congressman, he was free to speak his mind more forcefully and to advocate for change.
So he was no longer bound by the limitations of the presidency. He could really let loose. I bet he gave some fiery speeches on the House floor.
He did. In fact, there's this one famous speech from 1837 where he defended the right of abolitionists to petition Congress. At that time, Southern lawmakers were trying to silence any discussion of slavery in Congress. But Adams argued passionately for the right to free speech, even for those advocating for unpopular or even radical ideas.
That's pretty incredible. So he was willing to risk his own political capital to defend the principles of free speech and the right to petition the government.
Exactly. And his unwavering stance on this issue made him a target of pro-slavery forces in Congress. He faced threats and insults, and they even tried to censure him. But he never backed down.
Oh, he sounds like a real thorn in their side.
Well,
But how effective was he really? I mean, could one congressman, even a former president, really make a difference on an issue as massive and entrenched as slavery?
it's a great question. And while he didn't single-handedly end slavery, he did contribute significantly to the growing abolitionist movement.
So how did he do that?
Well, for one, he used his platform in Congress to raise awareness about the horrors of slavery. He read firsthand accounts of enslaved people, he challenged the legal arguments used to justify slavery, and he presented petitions from abolitionist groups all over the country.
So he was basically amplifying the voices of those who were fighting for abolition.
Yes, and he helped to shift public opinion by exposing the moral bankruptcy of slavery. He also used his legal expertise to challenge the expansion of slavery into new territories.
So he was fighting on multiple fronts, in the court of public opinion, in Congress, and in the legal arena. It's pretty remarkable that he had the energy and determination to do all of that after already serving as president.
It really is. And his second act in Congress highlights another important aspect of his legacy, his commitment to using the law to advance human rights.
Okay, I'm starting to see a pattern here. From his early diplomatic work to his fight against slavery, he seems to have had this deep belief in the power of law and diplomacy to solve complex problems.
That's a very astute observation, and it perhaps explains why he was drawn to these particular areas of public service. He believed that reason, logic, and principled argumentation could ultimately triumph over prejudice and injustice.
And did he succeed? I mean, obviously slavery was eventually abolished, but that didn't happen until after his death.
Right. And while he didn't live to see the end of slavery, his contributions to that fight were undeniable. He helped to lay the groundwork for the eventual success of the abolitionist movement.
So in a way, his legacy is intertwined with the legacy of the abolitionist movement itself.
Absolutely. And his story also reminds us that social change is often a long and arduous process with setbacks and disappointments along the way. But it also reminds us that the actions of individuals can have a profound impact on the course of history.
I'm really struck by his unwavering commitment to his principles, even when they are unpopular. It's inspiring to see someone so dedicated to fighting for what they believe in, even when the odds are stacked against them.
And that brings us to another fascinating chapter in Adam's life, a chapter that, unfortunately, the podcast only touches on briefly.
Oh, what's that? I'm all ears.
Well, in 1841, John Quincy Adams took on yet another seemingly impossible challenge. He agreed to represent a group of enslaved Africans who had revolted against their captors on a ship called the Amistad.
The Amistad case, I was vaguely remember learning about that in history class. It was a pretty big deal, right?
It was a landmark case that went all the way to the Supreme Court. And Adams, at the age of 74, argued brilliantly on behalf of the Amistad captives, ultimately securing their freedom.
Wow, so he went from skinny dipping in the Potomac to arguing before the Supreme Court to free enslaved people? That's quite a range.
It really speaks to the breadth of his intellect and his unwavering commitment to justice.
But I'm curious about his personal life. The podcast focused mostly on his political and diplomatic career. What was he like as a person?
Well, from what we can gather, he was a complex and often contradictory figure. He was known for his intelligence, his work ethic, and his dedication to public service, but he could also be aloof, stubborn, and even prickly at times.
I guess that makes him human, right? We all have our flaws. But I'm still trying to wrap my head around his relationship with his father, John Adams. It must have been tough living in the shadow of such a towering figure in American history.
Absolutely. The podcast doesn't delve too deeply into their personal dynamics, but it does hint at a complicated and sometimes strained relationship.
Do you think he ever felt like he was living in his father's shadow, constantly trying to prove himself?
It's certainly possible, and it's a question worth pondering as we continue to unpack John Quincy Adams' life and legacy.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here, from diplomacy to slavery to the Supreme Court. But there's still one big question that I think we need to address. Was John Quincy Adams ultimately a success or a failure?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And it's one that historians continue to debate. But perhaps instead of trying to fit him neatly into one category or the other, we should consider him as a product of his time, a man who embodied both the promise and the contradictions of America's early years.
You know, it's interesting to think about how John Quincy Adams fits into like the whole big picture of American history.
Yeah.
You know, he's born into this world of privilege and power, shaped by, the legacy of the Founding Fathers.
Yeah.
But he also lived through a period of just massive change.
Yeah.
As America, transitioned from this fledgling republic to this rapidly expanding and increasingly democratic nation.
Right. And his struggles, I think, and contradictions maybe reflect the struggles and contradictions of America itself.
Right.
During this really formative period,
Well,
He was a man between two eras,
yeah.
trying to reconcile the ideals of the past with the messy realities of the present.
And it seems like he wasn't always successful in finding that balance.
Yeah.
He had this grand vision for America,
Right.
the American system.
Yeah.
But it faced a lot of opposition, especially from the South.
Right.
His presidency was marked by, political infighting and ultimately ended in defeat.
Yeah, but I think even in his failures, we can learn something about the challenges of leadership.
Yeah.
And the complexities of navigating a political landscape shaped by, competing interests and ideologies.
Okay, so maybe we shouldn't judge him solely on his political successes or failures.
Right.
But what about his legacy?
Yeah.
How should we remember John Quincy Adams?
Well, his legacy is multifaceted, just like the man himself. On one hand, he was a brilliant diplomat, a skilled negotiator, and a staunch defender of American interests on the world stage.
Right.
His contributions to shaping the Monroe Doctrine had a profound and lasting impact on U.S. foreign policy.
And I think we also have to acknowledge his, unwavering commitment to principles like freedom of speech and the rule of law.
Oh, yeah.
He was willing to stand up for what he believed in, even when it was unpopular or even dangerous.
Yeah.
His defense of the Amistad captives is just a powerful testament to that.
Absolutely. And while he may not have single-handedly ended slavery, his tireless efforts to challenge its expansion and to raise awareness about its injustices really helped pave the way for the abolitionist movement's eventual success.
So he may not have been a perfect president, but he was a man of conviction,
Yeah.
a principled leader who left an undeniable mark on American history.
I think that's a fair assessment. And perhaps that's the most important lesson we can take away from this deep dive into John Quincy Adams' life. True leadership isn't about always being right or always winning.
Yeah.
It's about having the courage to stand up for what you believe in, even when it's difficult,
Yeah.
even when the odds are stacked against you.
And it's about using your position, your voice, your influence to make a positive impact on the world, no matter how big or small that impact might be.
Well said. And I think John Quincy Adams, with all his complexities and contradictions, really embodied that spirit.
Yeah, I agree. So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to pose one final question to you, our listener. What do you think John Quincy Adams would say about the state of American democracy today?
Ooh.
What challenges do you think he would recognize? What opportunities would he seize?
That's a really thought-provoking question, and one that I hope each of you will take some time to ponder.
Thank you for joining us on this journey through the life and times of John Quincy Adams. We hope you've learned something new, gained a deeper understanding of American history, and maybe even been inspired to think a little differently about the challenges and opportunities we face today.
And if you'd like to explore this topic further, we highly recommend checking out the full episode of the American History Hit podcast that served as the basis for our deep dive today. It's a fascinating and engaging listen.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.